Hey, and welcome to this Freaky Friday edition of Liquid Lunch on Newsmax TV. I'm John Tobacco, and we're coming to you live as we do every day, Monday to Friday, noon to 1 Eastern. We are high atop Midtown Manhattan at the Newsmax headquarters and downtown, and we're at the Question Tequila Studios, of course. We are downtown at the New York Stock Exchange. The Dow is still recovering from the other day, and even yesterday the market was down, was up 300, and then Trump started tweeting about China tariffs, and lo and behold, the market's down 300. So we had a 600-point swing yesterday. Oh no, and it's down again today, down over 200 now. There was a little bit of a recovery, I thought, in the morning, but this tariff stuff that Trump is saying he's going to put new tariffs in place starting September 1st, and China isn't being genuine at the negotiating table. So he's laying it to him, and he's laying it to the markets as well. There's all kinds of crazy things going on. Bitcoin is still above 10,000, which is, I think, a good sign. I think the government intervention that we've been seeing over the last months since Facebook came out with the Libra coin and Trump started saying he thought that Bitcoin is just thin air, and now the IRS and state regulators are looking into all different facets of cryptocurrency, could put some serious downward pressure on this stuff. So keep your eye on those Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and stay very nimble, and there could be a lot of volatility ahead for cryptocurrencies here in America. And volatility there is not when Frank Morano joins us, because he's my stabilizer. He's my equalizer.
That's right.
He keeps me sane. He keeps me straight. Frankie, good afternoon in New York.
Good afternoon in New York, and on the East Coast, good morning to the rest of the country. Quite a bit in the news, including what John just alluded to, and that is some of what I'll be speaking, frankly, about. A nuclear arms treaty between the United States and Russia is dead. It was announced in Washington today that the U.S. has formally withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Moscow. The treaty that was ratified in 1987 limited the development of ground-based missiles. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in a statement that Russia is solely responsible for the treaty's demise because of its non-compliant missile system. It's difficult for some of us to understand how withdrawing from a treaty will get Russia to do a better job of complying with it, but I suppose we'll see. China says it doesn't want a trade war with the United States, but it's not afraid of fighting one. That's part of Beijing's foreign ministry response to President Trump's threat to impose a 10% tariff on another $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. Trump made the threat in a series of tweets yesterday. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson said that Beijing would have to take countermeasures if the U.S. puts tariffs on more Chinese goods. The president has indicated that the new tariffs will go into effect on September 1st. So that's what's happening.
And you always cover it so well. I love when you speak frankly. And when you have a guy like Frank Morano with you, you don't have to do a heck of a lot of work, because the guy's a workhorse. And he's been working hard as heck at bringing in the best guests in here, the people that know where the rubber meets the road. And joining us today in the leadoff spot, Murray Sabrin joins us. Dr. Sabrin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John.
He is a professor of economics at Ramapo College, finance at Ramapo College. And you might remember Dr. Sabrin. He's been on What's the Deal, our Sunday show right here on Newsmax TV. And your newest book, Why the Federal Reserve Sucks, is what we're here to talk about today. And why don't you tell our audience who, I think, Doc, most people don't even understand what the Federal Reserve is, right? People think it's like a government agency. They don't know that it's not. No. But tell me what inspired you to write a book about the Federal Reserve sucking?
Well, I've been following the Federal Reserve now for nearly 50 years. I've been writing about it, speaking about it, and I was on sabbatical a couple of years ago and came up with a topic about this bubble that we're in, the third bubble we've been in the last 25 years, and what is it going to mean for the economy? And why didn't the Federal Reserve officials, Greenspan and Bernanke, notice that there was a bubble going on? So what I did is I reviewed their testimony to Congress while they were Fed chairman, and they were missing the boat completely about why the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, which Bernanke admits manipulates interest rates. And when you manipulate something, bad outcomes occur. And that's the essence of the book, that we don't need a Federal Reserve or a central bank manipulating interest rates to the level where savers are being hurt, which has happened throughout the country, throughout the world. In Europe and in Japan, interest rates are below zero. This is unheard of in Western civilization.
Well, I was talking to, you probably know him, Arthur Cashin yesterday.
Sure.
He's a New York Stock Exchange legend. He's probably one of the most learned guys I know about all facets of capital markets. And he was telling me that starting very soon, UBS is going to be charging people to leave cash on deposit with them. So now we all have this old thing in our head. You put your money in the bank, you get paid a little interest. At UBS, they're saying because there are negative interest rates across Europe and all the central banks, that it costs them money to hold cash reserves, and they're going to charge you for them holding your money.
We're in uncharted waters. We've never seen this before in the history of the world. So the central banks are basically taking a lit match and going through a dynamite factory. They're blowing up the economy, and I think this is why Trump is so concerned. He wants to keep the bubble going. I quote in my book, when he was running for president, he said, we have a big fat bubble going on, and yet he wants it to continue.
We played that clip the other day when he was urging the Fed to cut interest rates, so it's very ironic that he's singing a different tune now that this is happening on his watch. But I've been reading your book. I've learned a lot from it. I agree with a lot of what's in there, and it's clear that savers are being punished, as you mentioned. But my question is, what's the alternative? If we're not going to have the Fed control interest rates, who should be controlling interest rates?
Very simple. It's the marketplace. The marketplace determines the price of soda, iPhones, clothing. Everything that we purchase is controlled by supply and demand. The same thing should happen for interest rates. And I think if we had that type of system in place, we would be a stronger economy. We would have sustainable prosperity instead of this yo-yo economy, which when we know when it goes up, everyone's happy, but when it crashes, you have a lot of pain. And we saw a lot of pain in the Great Recession. And I think it's incumbent upon policymakers to understand money and credit and banking, which I explained in the first couple of chapters of the book. So if enough people read the book, then we can have a national discussion, a national debate, if you will, about do we need the Federal Reserve to manipulate interest rates? Obviously, if private citizens in businesses manipulate interest rates, they get investigated by the government for collusion.
But there should be a central bank, right?
Well, they can clear checks. That's what they could do. Otherwise, we don't need a central bank.
I agree.
Because we didn't have a central bank prior to the Federal Reserve. We had attempts at central banking in the early part of the 19th century, and they were failures because they manipulated money and credit, and they gave us banking panics. Remember, throughout the 19th century, we had banking panics because the banks operate under a flawed business model, which everyone can see at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, which will be shown at the end of this year, where people go to the bank, the Bailey Savings and Loan, to try to get their money out. But George Bailey says, I don't have your money. It's on deposit here, but we loaned it to someone to buy a house.
Right.
So what the banks do is they borrow short from us and lend long. That's a recipe for disaster that has happened throughout the 19th century. And then when we had the Panic of 1907, the bankers got together at a secret meeting in Jekyll Island with members of Congress who were favorable to Wall Street, and they hammered out basically the Federal Reserve Act that was signed in 1913. And here we are more than 100 years later, and we have the biggest bubble, I think, in financial history, and I think it's going to end very badly.
I think, and I was shouting about this back in 2008 and 2009. My background is in short selling, so I saw that many of the bank stocks were way overvalued. But I thought under Obama and under Bernanke that the government ran one of the biggest Ponzi schemes ever when they lowered interest rates to zero. If you remember that, they lowered rates to zero. And then the banks were not incentivized in any way to lend money to people because they can borrow money at the Fed for zero and then take their trading division and go buy treasury bonds and get paid 2.5%.
Right.
So to me, that was a government Ponzi that really started a lot of this, because who would ever lend to John Tobacco or Dr. Murray Sabrin or Frank Morano for that matter? What bank would lend to any of us if they can borrow from the government at zero and then buy some bonds and notes and treasuries and get paid 2.5%?
Not only that, the banks now have $2 trillion in excess reserves. Historically, banks kept very little in reserves, excess reserves, because they loaned it out to get interest on their loans. So now the Federal Reserve is paying them interest on their excess reserves, so they're keeping money aside, which in one way is a good thing, because if that money enters the economy, it's going to lift prices and inflation is going to accelerate to the point where the Federal Reserve will really have to tighten up money and credit like they did in 2006 and 2007 and other episodes, and we have a crash. So the crash is inevitable once the Fed engages in money printing or easy money.
Frankie, Danielle DiMartino, the author of Fed Up, former Fed employee, was on with us the other day, and she was talking about the interest on excess reserves. And you always talk about how many people in our audience rely on that interest income, and they're not getting it.
Well, they used to. Now nobody can rely on that interest to make a living unless you already have $100 million to start. Then maybe you can get by on your interest. But no one's getting by on 2.5%, 3% interest and being able to make a living. And you're lucky if you get that.
Wait,
from
who was getting 2.5%
exactly.
interest?
Well, exactly.
The Fed did announce that they were lowering the rate on interest on excess reserves that they pay banks.
Right.
But it's still going to be around 2.25 or two. What's the
Something.
new?
Two and a quarter.
2.25. So the banks are still incentivized, Frank, to leave excess reserves with the Fed and not lend to people.
So, Dr. Sabrin,
but people get paid 25 basis points, 1/4% if they're lucky, not 2.5%.
That's why I've taken such issue with you urging, the Chairman Powell to cut interest rates by 50 basis points, and rather than just 25, we need to be raising interest rates.
No. Doc, I've been saying for a while that I think the more the Fed raises rates, number one, it builds in some fat if we do have a bubble burst where they can take some quick preventive action. But the other thing is, as the rates go higher, the banks have more incentive to lend.
Sure.
They'll take more risk because they can make a bigger spread. I only was asking for 50 basis points to say, let's get it out of Trump's system and not have all this stuff. But now he's still going to be looking for more.
Dr. Sabrin, as far as you're concerned, the stock market growth we've seen, the whole economic recovery, this is just another bubble, like the real estate bubble and the dot-com bubble.
This is what people have called the everything bubble. The everything bubble is where the stock market's inflated, the bond market's inflated, collectibles are inflated. Look what happened last week. A pair of Nike sneakers went for more than $400,000. That's unheard of. That sneakers would go for $400,000. Artwork is going for $100 million. This is an example, the consequences of easy money, where the money has flooded the system and people have so much cash that they're willing to pay extraordinary prices for
Speaking
things.
of artwork, Dr. Sabrin, thank you very much. You're an artiste in this book, and we're going to have Scotty Lebedo, Citizen Scott, patriotic artist, with us a little later on the show. You're watching Liquid Lunch. Back after this.